Imagine waking up on your wedding day as a full legal person with rights, property, and money, then going to bed that night as legally nobody. Not metaphorically nobody, legally nobody. For over 1,000 years, this was every married woman's reality. The moment she said I do, English and American law said she didn't exist anymore. Her husband could sell her property, spend her wages, take her children, and she had zero legal recourse because she had literally ceased to be a person. Welcome to tonight's journey through history's most hidden legal injustice. I'm here to walk you through this story while you wind down for the night. Get comfortable, maybe grab some tea or cocoa. If this is your kind of content, hit subscribe, it really helps. And drop a comment letting me know where you're listening from and what time it is there. I love seeing our little community spread across time zones, all diving into history together before sleep. The shocking disappearance. Picture this. England, 1765. A bustling church on an ordinary street. Bells ring out in celebration as guests cheer and throw flowers. Another wedding, another happy beginning. The bride looks radiant in her white gown, smiling as she walks toward her future. But here's what nobody's talking about in those cheers and congratulations. In about 30 minutes, this woman, this full legal person standing here, is about to completely vanish from the eyes of the law. She doesn't know it yet, but the moment she says I do, English law will say she doesn't exist anymore. This isn't poetry or metaphor. This is legal reality under something called coverture, the doctrine that transformed married women from autonomous human beings into legal ghosts. Think about that for a second. She's standing there as a person who can own property, make contracts, earn wages. In 30 minutes, none of that will be true anymore. The wedding proceeds exactly like you'd expect. Vows exchanged, rings slipped on fingers, guests dabbing their eyes with handkerchiefs. You may kiss the bride, applause fills the church, rice gets thrown, everyone's crying happy tears, but legally speaking, something horrifying just happened. This woman just disappeared, completely. Her legal identity got absorbed into her husband's. She became what lawyers called a femme covert, a covered woman, hidden, erased, gone. What does legal disappearance actually mean? Everything she owned, her clothes, jewelry, money, even land she inherited, all of it instantly belongs to her husband now. Her wages if she works, his property. Her children, they might have together. Legally his alone. She can't write a will, can't sign contracts, can't sue anyone, not even if someone attacks her, because legally speaking, she's not there anymore to do any of those things. The famous legal scholar William Blackstone explained it perfectly in 1765, the same year as our wedding. He wrote, "By marriage, the husband and wife are one person in law. The very being or legal existence of the woman is suspended during the marriage." Suspended, like she's just hanging there in legal limbo, not dead, not alive in the eyes of the law, just gone. And this wasn't some obscure legal technicality, this was everyday reality. Picture our bride a few months later. Maybe her husband drinks too much and gambles away her inheritance. Maybe he's cruel to her. Maybe he decides to sell her grandmother's jewelry to pay his debts. What can she do about it? Nothing. Absolutely nothing. She has no legal standing to object. If she tries to take him to court, the judge will literally tell her she doesn't exist in the law's eyes. She's a ghost trying to file a lawsuit. Here's what gets me about this whole system. It wasn't just England. This legal erasure of married women happened across cultures, across centuries. Rome had it. Medieval Europe perfected it. Colonial America imported it wholesale. For over 1,000 years, half the population would go to bed on their wedding night, having lost their legal right to exist as independent human beings. How did this become so normal, so accepted, so universal? That's what we're going to find out together. We'll travel back to ancient Rome, to see where this idea first took root. We'll discover how different cultures found remarkably similar ways to make married women legally vanish, but we'll also uncover the amazing exceptions, like ancient Egypt, where women kept everything and more, and the brave women who fought back against these laws, often risking everything to reclaim their legal existence. So let's step away from this English church in 1765, leaving our newly invisible bride to navigate her strange new reality as a legal ghost. Let's travel much further back in time to ancient Rome, where this whole system of legal erasure through marriage first began to take shape. Because if we want to understand how marriage became a way to make women disappear, we need to see where this nightmare originally came from. Ancient Rome's manus marriage. Picture this: Rome, 150 BCE. Marble columns everywhere, the smell of olive oil and wine in the air. Senators in togas arguing politics while slaves hurry past carrying amphorae. But here's what's really happening in those grand villas and crowded tenements. Every single day, Roman women are walking into marriage ceremonies as legal people and walking out as nobody. Not metaphorically nobody, legally nobody. They call it manus marriage, and it's about to become the blueprint for erasing married women across the entire Western world. Manus literally means hand in Latin, but it's not about holding hands, it's about ownership. See, in Rome, everyone belongs to someone's manus, their legal power. Children belong to their father's manus, slaves belong to their master's manus, and when a woman marries, she transfers from her father's manus straight into her husband's manus, same legal category as his children, same legal status as his slaves. She doesn't become his partner, she becomes his property. And here's the thing that gets me. This wasn't considered cruel. This was just how marriage worked. The moment she says those wedding vows, everything changes. Her name? Gone. She takes his family name because she's now part of his household. Her property? His property. That dowry her family gave belongs to him now. Her legal identity completely absorbed into his. She can't sign contracts, can't sue anyone, can't even be sued herself. Why? Because legally she doesn't exist anymore. She's become what Romans call an alien heirs under someone else's legal power, and there's absolutely nothing she can do about it. Let me tell you about Senator Marcus Aurelius Corvus. Not the emperor, different guy. He marries Claudia, daughter of another senator. Huge wedding, half of Rome's elite there. Claudia brings a massive dowry, vineyards, urban properties, a fleet of trading ships. Day before the wedding, she's one of the wealthiest people in Rome. Day after, she owns absolutely nothing. Marcus can sell her ships, mortgage her vineyards, gamble away her inheritance, and if she objects, legally, she has no standing. She's not a person who can object to anything. Now meet Livia. She's enslaved, works in a bakery, saved up enough money over years to almost buy her freedom. Then her owner arranges her marriage to another enslaved person, Gaius. You'd think things couldn't get worse for someone who's already enslaved, right? Wrong. Under manus marriage, even enslaved women lose what little they had. Those savings she scraped together now belong to Gaius. That small bit of autonomy she had, gone. She went from being property with a tiny bit of personal agency to being, well, property with even less. And here's Julia. She's plebeian, working class, runs a small tavern with her mother, serves wine and bread to labourers. She's good at it, built up a decent clientele. Then she marries Titus, a carpenter. The tavern, legally his now. The recipes her grandmother taught her. The relationships with suppliers she spent years building. All his. Julia can still work there, sure, but every decision goes through Titus. Every copper coin earned belongs to him. She went from being a business owner to being an employee in her own tavern. Here's how insane this system gets. Under Manius, A husband has patria potestas over his wife, the same absolute power Roman fathers have over their children. He can punish her physically, he can restrict where she goes, who she sees, he can sell her jewellery, her clothes, anything she brought to the marriage, and get this, if she commits adultery, he can legally kill her, not divorce her, kill her, the same way he could execute his own children or enslaved people, because legally she's in the exact same category. But wait, there's a loophole. Elite Roman families start figuring out something called sine manu marriage, marriage without the hand. Here, the woman stays under her father's manus instead of transferring to her husband's. Sounds terrible, but it's actually genius. Her father's usually dead or doesn't care about day-to-day decisions, so she gets something closer to independence. She can inherit property, make some contracts, even initiate divorce. But here's the catch. Only the wealthy can afford the legal paperwork to set this up. Think about daily life under this system. Roman women wake up every morning knowing they can't buy anything without permission, can't help a friend in legal trouble because they can't appear in court, can't leave money to their children in a will because they can't write wills. Their husbands control every aspect of their lives, and it's completely legal. And society thinks this is natural, proper, the way things should be. Poets write about it like it's romantic. Philosophers defend it as necessary for social order. By the later Roman Empire, things start shifting slightly. More families use sine manu marriages. Women begin finding small spaces of autonomy. But here's what's terrifying. As Rome falls and new kingdoms rise across Europe, they don't abandon these ideas. They double down on them. Christian theology mixes with Roman law, and suddenly you've got religious justification for legal erasure. The Germanic tribes adopting Roman customs. And all of this is heading toward medieval Europe, where these ideas are about to get much, much worse. So Rome falls, but Manu's marriage doesn't die with it. Instead, it evolves. Those Norman invaders who'll conquer England in 1066, they're bringing Roman legal traditions with them. Those Christian scholars developing church doctrine, they're reading Roman texts about marriage and family. And all of this ancient Roman idea that marriage should legally erase women is about to spread across all of medieval Europe and eventually cross the Atlantic to America. The blueprint for coverture was written right here in ancient Rome. Medieval Europe's coverture begins. From those manicured Roman villas, we're jumping forward, way forward, past the collapse of the empire, past the Dark Ages, landing in medieval Europe around the 12th century. The landscape's different now, rougher, castles instead of marble columns. But here's what's wild. They're about to create something that makes Roman Manu's marriage look almost progressive. A legal doctrine so complete, so thorough in erasing women, that it will survive for 800 years. They called it coverture, and honestly, the name doesn't even hint at how devastating it was. Picture medieval Europe. We're talking Norman conquest territory, William the Conqueror's legal system mixing with local customs. And here's where it gets interesting. The Normans brought their own marriage laws, brutal ones, but then something happened. Christian doctrine started weaving into these legal traditions. The church had this concept about marriage creating one flesh. Beautiful in theory, right? Husband and wife becoming one. But in legal practice, that one person was always the husband, always. The wife just disappeared. Not physically, legally, completely. And the lawyers loved it because it simplified everything. The theological backing made it bulletproof. What God hath joined together, right? If God made them one flesh, then the law just had to figure out how that worked practically. And medieval lawyers, they were creative. They decided that since husband and wife were one person, they needed one legal identity, one set of rights, one person who could own property, make decisions, represent the family in court. Guess which person that was? never the wife. This wasn't accidental. This was systematic legal engineering designed to concentrate power, and it worked. God did it work. By the 13th century, coverture was spreading across England like wildfire. The word itself comes from the French couvrir, to cover. The husband literally covered the wife's legal existence with his own. She became what lawyers called femme covert, a covered woman. Hidden, protected, they claimed. But here's the thing about being protected under someone else's identity. You stop existing as yourself. Every contract she might want to sign, he signs. Every lawsuit involving her, he represents her. Every piece of property she inherits, his. Her wages if she works, his. Even her clothes belong to him. Fast forward to 1765. William Blackstone writes his commentaries on the laws of England. This becomes the most influential legal text in English history, and Blackstone puts it so clearly it's chilling. By marriage, the husband and wife are one person in law. The very being or legal existence of the woman is suspended during the marriage. Suspended, not diminished, not limited. Suspended, as in paused, as in she becomes a legal ghost walking through her own life. Blackstone wasn't criticizing this. He was explaining it, codifying it, making it sound reasonable and civilized. Think about what suspended legal existence actually means. She can't write a will, can't make a contract, can't sue someone who cheats her, can't be sued either. Because legally, she's not there to sue. If someone owes her money, they pay her husband. If she commits a crime, in some cases, her husband is legally responsible because she's presumed to be acting under his direction. She's like a perpetual child, except children eventually grow up. Married women, they only became legal persons again if their husbands died. Only then. Death was the only escape clause. Now imagine you're a noblewoman in 13th century England. Your father dies. You inherit vast estates, hundreds of acres, maybe thousands, villages full of serfs who owe you loyalty. You've got real power for exactly as long as you stay single. The moment you marry, everything transfers to your husband. Not symbolically, legally. Those lands your family held for generations. His now. The serfs who swore oaths to your bloodline, they serve him. You become a guest in your own ancestral home. And if he decides to sell everything and move to France, you have zero legal standing to stop him. Medieval court records are full of these tragedies. Lady Eleanor de Clare inherited massive estates from her father, married young to strengthen political alliances. Her husband immediately started selling off her family lands to finance his military campaigns. Eleanor wrote letter after letter to the king, begging for intervention. The response? She had no legal standing to complain. The land was her husband's now, her family's centuries-old holdings gone, and she could do absolutely nothing about it. This wasn't unusual. This was Tuesday in medieval England. Standard operating procedure for married women. What made coverture so powerful was how complete it was. Roman manus marriage was brutal, but it was Roman law. Local customs could vary. Medieval coverture, it spread everywhere English law touched, from England to Wales to Ireland, later to colonial America. It crossed oceans, survived centuries, adapted to new circumstances while keeping its core principle intact. Married women don't legally exist. The church bless it. The lawyers systematized it. The nobility used it to consolidate power. And regular families, they just accepted it as natural, as God's will, as the way things had always been. Try to imagine the psychological impact. You grow up as a person. You make decisions, own things, have opinions that matter. Then you get married and legally become nobody. Your husband can read your mail, spend your inheritance, beat you with minimal legal consequences. If you complain to authorities, they ask, "Where's your husband?" because you can't represent yourself in any official capacity. You're not a person. You're a legal appendage, a permanent dependent. Some women went mad from this, others found ways to work around it, but most just disappeared into their husbands' identities, became footnotes in someone else's life story. So we've established the foundation. Coverture is spreading across medieval Europe like a virus. The legal infrastructure is in place, the religious justification is solid, the social acceptance is complete, but we haven't talked about what happens next. How this system handles money, children, work, death, how it creates traps so sophisticated that escaping becomes nearly impossible. Because what we've covered so far, this is just the beginning. The framework. Wait until you hear what this legal structure does to every aspect of a woman's existence. That's where things get really dark. The husband and wife are one. William Blackstone wrote these words in 1765, but he wasn't being poetic, he was explaining English law. By marriage, the husband and wife are one person in law, that is, the very being or legal existence of the woman is suspended during the marriage. Suspended, like she'd been put on pause. And here's the kicker. He added what everyone already knew but rarely said out loud. That one person, it's the husband. Always the husband. Think about what that actually meant. The second a woman said I do, English law said she didn't exist anymore. Not metaphorically. Literally. She couldn't sue anyone. Couldn't be sued either. Couldn't write a contract. Couldn't write her own will. Every legal action had to go through her husband. It's like she became his shadow, except shadows don't usually own property before they disappear. Medieval England had turned marriage into a magic trick, where half the participants vanished. The restrictions were insane when you list them out. Can't own land, even if she inherited it. Can't control money, even if she earned it. Can't make business deals. Can't represent herself in court. Can't even give testimony in most cases without her husband's permission. Basically, she'd gone from being a legal person to being a very expensive piece of property. And unlike actual property, she was expected to be grateful for the arrangement. Here's where it gets personal. Lady Margaret Beaufort owned vast estates across England, massive wealth, political connections. She'd arranged marriages, funded universities, even helped put Henry VII on the throne. But the moment she married, again, for the fourth time actually, all that power, all that property, legally belonged to her new husband. She had to negotiate with him to access her own money, her own land. Think about that for a second. The transformation happened instantly. Wedding morning, she's a legal person who can sign documents, own property, make decisions. Wedding night, she's nobody. Courts called this civil death, which is probably the most honest thing they ever said about it. She was civilly dead, walking around, breathing, thinking, but legally, gone. Her husband could sell everything she'd brought to the marriage, and she couldn't do anything about it. Not legally, anyway. Property was the cruelest part. Everything became his. Her childhood home, her grandmother's jewellery, money she'd saved, even her clothes. Technically, her clothes. Judges ruled that husbands owned their wives' dresses. If she tried to leave and took her own clothing, that was theft. Her husband could have her arrested for stealing her own belongings. The law really thought this through. They covered every possible loophole that might let women maintain some tiny scrap of independence. Wealthy families saw this coming and tried to get creative. Marriage settlements, trust funds, legal documents designed to protect daughters' inheritances from their future husbands. But even these had limits. The husband still controlled how the money was spent during the marriage, still made all the decisions. These arrangements were more like allowances than actual ownership. Rich women got slightly nicer cages, but they were still cages. The law made sure of that. For working class women, coverture was a disaster. No fancy trust funds to soften the blow. If she worked, and lots of women worked, her wages belonged to her husband. Every penny. He could spend her entire paycheck at the tavern while their children went hungry, and she had zero legal recourse. Factory owners paid husbands directly sometimes, cutting wives out of the equation entirely. Women would work 12-hour days and never touch their own money. The emotional toll must have been crushing. Imagine being an independent person, making your own choices, handling your own affairs, then marriage erases all of that overnight. You're suddenly asking permission to spend money you earned, getting approval for decisions about your own life. Some women described feeling like ghosts in their own homes, present but powerless. Medieval laws had turned them into living contradictions, people who weren't legally people. Court records from this period are fascinating and depressing. Women trying to get around coverture laws, finding creative ways to maintain some control over their lives, hiding money, making secret agreements, using their children as legal proxies. The system was so restrictive that women became experts at working around it. They had to. It was survival. Some got caught and faced serious legal consequences for trying to control their own property. Imagine being punished for that. This is the world we're dealing with as we head into the next chapter. A legal system that made marriage the end of a woman's independent existence, where till death do us part meant till death brings back your legal rights. And we haven't even gotten to the worst part yet. What actually happened to everything she owned when she walked down that aisle? Spoiler alert, it wasn't pretty. The property grab that followed marriage was systematic, immediate, and absolutely devastating. What happened to her property? Picture this. You own a house, some land, maybe jewelry. Your grandmother left you, money you've saved. Then you get married, and overnight, gone. All of it. Not stolen, not lost. Legally transferred to your husband. Every last penny, every piece of property, every personal belonging. The moment those wedding vows ended, English and American law said everything you'd ever owned now belonged to him, completely. He could sell your childhood home tomorrow, if he wanted. This wasn't some obscure legal technicality. This was the foundation of marriage law for centuries. Your wedding dress? His property. The money your parents gave you as a wedding gift? His. That business you'd been running? His. Land you inherited from your father? His the second you said I do, and here's the part that'll make your stomach turn. You had zero legal recourse. None. You couldn't sue him, couldn't stop him, couldn't even complain in court. Think about what this meant in practical terms. Women would enter marriage owning substantial property, houses, farms, money, businesses their families had built over generations. Then wake up the next morning, legally owning nothing. Not even their own clothes technically belonged to them anymore. Their husbands could sell family heirlooms, mortgage ancestral land, spend inheritance money on gambling or mistresses, and wives could only watch it happen. No legal standing to object. No court would hear their case. Here's a story that'll haunt you. Lady Margaret Beaufort inherited vast estates in 15th century England, massive wealth, multiple properties. Then she married. Her new husband immediately started selling off her family's ancestral lands, places that had been in her bloodline for generations. She tried to stop him through family connections, through the church, through any informal channel she could find. But legally, she had no claim. Courts wouldn't even hear her petitions. Her own property, and she was powerless. The wealthy tried to find workarounds. Fathers would create complex trusts and marriage settlements, trying to protect their daughters' inheritances. They'd hire expensive lawyers, draft intricate contracts, set up elaborate legal structures. But even then, husbands found ways around these protections. And for working-class women, no such options existed. When Mary Johnson married in 1834 Boston, she lost her small savings, her sewing machine, and the tiny shop she'd built. Everything. Gone. Legally, his the moment the ceremony ended. The psychological impact was devastating. Imagine watching your life's work disappear, your security vanish, everything you'd built or inherited slipping through your fingers, and the law saying that's perfectly normal. That's how marriage is supposed to work. Women described feeling like ghosts haunting their former lives, walking through homes they used to own, working in businesses that were once theirs, wearing jewelry that legally belonged to their husbands. The very concept of mine disappeared from their vocabulary. Some husbands were decent about it. They'd consult their wives, make joint decisions, treat the property as ours, even though law said it was his. But decency was optional. Kindness was charity, not legal requirement. And when marriages went bad, when husbands became abusive or irresponsible, women discovered how completely vulnerable this system left them. No property meant no independence. No independence meant no escape. The law had created a perfect trap. Marriage became a financial prison for countless women. Court records reveal heartbreaking cases. Women pleading with judges, explaining how their husbands were destroying family businesses, selling homes out from under children, spending inheritance money on alcohol and gambling. The judges' responses were always the same. This is a matter between husband and wife. The law is clear. His property, his decision. One Massachusetts judge told a woman in 1847, "You chose marriage, madam. These are the consequences of that choice," as if she'd chosen to become legally invisible. The ripple effects were massive. Women avoided marriage to protect their property, choosing spinsterhood and social stigma over financial erasure. Others married and immediately regretted it, watching generations of family wealth disappear. Some tried hiding assets, secret bank accounts, property transfers to trusted relatives. But these schemes rarely worked long term. Husbands had legal tools to discover and claim hidden property. The system was designed to be inescapable. Once married, your economic independence was history. Your financial identity erased completely. What makes this even more infuriating, this wasn't ancient history we're talking about. These laws persisted well into the 19th century in England and America. Women were losing property to marriage when railways were being built, when telegraphs were connecting continents, when photography was being invented. Modern society in every way except women's property rights. Your great-great-grandmother might have lived through this, might have watched her inheritance become her husband's property overnight, might have spent years watching him destroy everything she'd once owned. The bitterness in women's letters from this era is palpable. They wrote about feeling betrayed, not just by individual husbands, but by society itself, by laws that promised marriage was partnership, while legally making it ownership, by courts that refused to acknowledge their pleas, by a system that said love meant legal disappearance. This wasn't just about money or property. This was about dignity, autonomy, the basic human right to own things. And for married women, that right simply didn't exist. The earnings she could never keep. Picture this. It's 1840, Lowell, Massachusetts. The textile mills are roaring. 12-hour days, 6 days a week. The women working these looms, they're making actual money for the first time in their lives. Real wages. But here's the thing that'll make your blood boil. Every single Friday, when the factory bell rings at closing time, there's a line of men waiting outside. Husbands, fathers, brothers. They're not there to walk their wives home. They're there to collect every penny these women just earned. See, under Coverture law, a married woman's wages belonged to her husband. Not some of them, all of them. She had zero legal claim to money she'd earned with her own hands. So picture Mary O'Sullivan, age 19, married 8 months. She's been threading bobbins since dawn, fingers bleeding, back aching. Payday comes. Her husband Patrick takes her entire week's wages, heads straight to Murphy's Tavern. By Sunday, it's gone. Mary goes hungry. Patrick doesn't. That was just Tuesday in industrial America. The factory owners knew exactly what was happening. They saw the same pattern every week. Women working themselves to exhaustion, creating wealth with their labour, then watching their husbands pocket it all. Some mill girls tried getting paid in company scrip instead of cash, thinking it might help. Didn't matter. Husbands could spend scrip just as fast at the company store. Other women begged their supervisors to pay them in secret. Risky move. If caught, they'd be fired, and their husbands could legally sue for the wages. Here's what gets me about this system. These weren't lazy women depending on their husbands. These were the breadwinners. Sarah Chen worked 14-hour shifts at a shoe factory in Lynn, Massachusetts. Her husband had been unemployed for 6 months. She was supporting him, their 3 kids, and his elderly mother. But legally, every cent she made belonged to him. He could spend it on whiskey while his family ate bread and water, and there was absolutely nothing Sarah could do about it under the law. The desperate creativity of these women, though, it breaks your heart and amazes you at the same time. Some would hide coins in their shoes, their hair sewn into their skirts. Others made deals with sympathetic shopkeepers, buy groceries on credit, pay when the husband wasn't looking. A few bold ones opened secret accounts under their maiden names. Incredibly dangerous. If discovered, their husbands could have them arrested for theft of their own wages, because legally, that money was never theirs to begin with. The mill towns were full of stories like Catherine Murphy's, 22 years old, supporting her alcoholic husband and 2 babies on her textile wages. Every Friday, he'd be waiting at the factory gates, often already drunk. She'd hand over her pay, knowing her children would go to bed hungry again. Catherine started eating her one meal at work, saving her dinner portion for the kids. She lost £30 that winter. Her husband gained 15. The system was literally transferring nutrition from working mothers to idle men. What made this even more twisted? The factory work was brutal. Textile mills in the 1840s were death traps, windows nailed shut to keep humidity high, lint floating everywhere, women coughing up blood, accidents constantly, crushed fingers, scalped heads when hair got caught in machinery. These women were risking their lives and health every day, then watching their husbands drink away what they'd earned with their blood and sweat. Some women died on the job, and their final week's wages still went to their husbands, not their children. The really heartbreaking part, many of these women had been supporting themselves just fine before marriage. Take Elizabeth Porter, single. She'd saved up enough money working in Boston to send her younger siblings to school. Got married at 25. Suddenly, everything she'd saved became her husband's property overnight. He spent it all on a failed business venture within a month. She went from financial independence to complete dependence in the span of a wedding ceremony. Her siblings had to drop out of school. Some factory towns tried to help. In Waltham, Massachusetts, a few boarding house matrons would quietly hold wages for married women, claiming the company had delayed payment. Bought these wives a day or two to hide money or buy necessities before their husbands showed up. But even these small acts of kindness were technically illegal. The matrons could be prosecuted for interfering with a husband's property rights, because that's what a woman's labour was under, coverture, her husband's property, not her own contribution to survival. The psychological toll was devastating. These women knew their worth, they could see the value they created with their own hands every day, but the law told them they were worth nothing, owned nothing, earned nothing. Many started believing it. Depression was rampant in factory towns. Some women stopped trying to save money or improve their situations. What was the point? Everything would just go to their husbands anyway. The system wasn't just stealing their wages, it was stealing their sense of self-worth and agency. By the 1850s, this wage theft was becoming impossible to ignore. Factory women were writing letters to newspapers, sharing their stories. Reformers started connecting the dots. If women couldn't keep their own wages, how could they ever escape bad marriages or support their children? The answer was chilling. They couldn't. And that brings us to perhaps the most heartbreaking aspect of coverture law. What happened when these same women tried to protect their children? Because under the law, those children didn't belong to their mothers either. Her children weren't legally hers. Here's something that will keep you up at night. Under coverture, a mother had zero legal claim to her own children. None. The kids belonged entirely to the father. Even if he was violent, drunk, or completely absent, still his kids legally. A woman could carry a baby for 9 months, nurse them, raise them, love them more than life itself, and her husband could take them away tomorrow, just because he felt like it. Think about that for a second. You know how protective mothers are, that fierce instinct to guard your children. Now imagine having absolutely no legal power to do it. In 1840s England, Sarah Mitchell watched her husband give their 3 young daughters to his sister to raise. Why? Because he was angry about her inheritance money. Sarah begged, pleaded, even tried to steal them back, but legally she was nobody. The children belonged to him. And this wasn't some rare occurrence. Court records from the 1800s are full of these cases. Fathers selling their sons into apprenticeships at age 7 or 8, pocketing the money, and mothers having no say. Some apprenticeships were decent, but others were basically child labour contracts. 10-year-olds working 16-hour days in dangerous factories. Their mothers knew it, hated it, but couldn't legally stop it. The father's word was law. Here's what gets me about this. These weren't deadbeat dads or absent fathers. These were husbands living in the same house, watching their wives care for the children every single day, but the law said those kids belonged to the man. Period. A mother could be the perfect parent, devoted, loving, responsible, and her husband could still hand the children over to strangers if he wanted. No court would stop him. The most heartbreaking cases involved divorce, though that barely existed back then. When marriages did end, usually through legal separation, the husband kept the children automatically. Always. There was no custody hearing, no discussion of what's best for the kids. The father got them because he was legally their owner. Mothers would lose their homes, their money, and their children all at once. Complete devastation. Caroline Norton learned this the hard way in 1836. Her husband was physically abusive, so she left him and he immediately took their 3 young boys. Caroline was a successful writer, financially independent, clearly the better parent. Didn't matter. English law said the children belonged to their father. She spent years fighting in court, writing pamphlets, becoming one of the first women to publicly challenge these custody laws. But initially, she lost everything. The cruelty was sometimes deliberate. Husbands would threaten to take the children away as a way to control their wives. Behave yourself or you'll never see them again. And it worked. Women stayed in terrible marriages, endured abuse, gave up their dreams, because they couldn't risk losing their kids. The law turned motherhood into a hostage situation. Children became weapons men could use against the women who bore them. Even death didn't guarantee a mother's rights. If a father died, he could will the children to guardians in his will, completely bypassing their mother. Imagine that. Your husband dies, you're grieving, and then you discover he's legally given your children to his brother or business partner. You might have raised them for years, but legally, you had no more claim to them than a stranger on the street would. Some mothers tried desperate measures. They'd secretly move away with their children, change their names, start over somewhere new. But if they were caught, kidnapping charges. They were literally stealing their own children according to the law. Mary Ann Clark did this in 1844, fleeing London with her 2 daughters when her husband threatened to send them to a harsh boarding school. She lived in hiding for 3 years, constantly terrified of being discovered. The psychological damage was enormous. Children torn from loving mothers, mothers driven to desperation, fathers wielding absolute power over innocent lives. Some women had nervous breakdowns. Others never recovered from losing their children. And the kids. They grew up knowing their fathers had complete control over them, while their mothers were legally powerless. That's not exactly healthy family dynamics. The whole system was toxic from every angle. But here's the thing about widowhood, and this is where our story takes an interesting turn. The moment a woman's husband died, she suddenly became a legal person again, a female soul who could own property, sign contracts, make decisions, and yet finally have legal standing regarding her children. For some women, despite the grief, widowhood felt like waking up from a legal nightmare. Freedom at last. The widow's brief freedom. London, 1782. Margaret Thornton wakes up a widow. Her husband died in his sleep 3 days ago. She's devastated, genuinely grief-stricken, and for the first time in 23 years of marriage, she's legally a person again. This is the twisted paradox of coverture. Death was liberation. The moment her husband's heart stopped beating, Margaret transformed from legal property back into a human being with rights. She can sign contracts now, own property, make decisions. It's the cruelest mercy imaginable. The transformation happened instantly. No paperwork needed, no court proceedings. One moment she's a covered woman, invisible to the law. The next she's femme soul. A woman alone, but a woman who exists legally, again. Think about how insane this is. Her legal personhood was tied to her husband's pulse. While he lived, she was nobody. The second he died, boom, property rights, contract rights, the ability to represent herself in court. All because the man who legally owned her existence was gone. Femme soul meant everything. As a widow, Margaret could finally write her own will. She could buy and sell property without anyone's permission. If someone owed her money, she could sue them directly. She could enter into business partnerships, sign leases, even lend money at interest. These sound like basic human rights today, but for married women, impossible. Only death could give them back what marriage had stolen. And yes, many widows felt guilty about feeling relieved alongside their grief. Her property situation flipped overnight. Everything her dead husband had owned, now hers, at least the portion the law designated as her dower, usually 1/3 of his estate. But here's what's wild. Any property she'd brought to the marriage, that had become his when she married. Now it came back to her, if there was anything left. Many women discovered their inheritances had been sold, gambled away, or used to pay their husband's debts. Widowhood was freedom, sometimes to absolutely nothing. Mary Wollstonecraft wrote about this in the 1790s. She knew widows who described feeling like they'd awakened from a long sleep. One minute you're asking permission to buy thread for mending. The next, you're negotiating with merchants, managing investments, making decisions about your children's education. Some widows thrived. They opened businesses, bought property, remarried on their own terms, or chose not to remarry at all, because remarriage meant legal death all over again. Some women learned that lesson once, and refused the second burial. The guilt was real though. How do you mourn your husband while secretly celebrating your freedom? Widows wrote about this in private letters, feeling terrible for feeling liberated. They loved their husbands, many of them, but they'd also been legal prisoners, and prison doesn't stop being prison just because your warden is kind. The grief was genuine. The relief was also genuine. Both could exist at the same time. Society didn't make room for that complexity, but the feelings existed anyway. Society watched these newly independent women suspiciously. A widow with money and legal rights? Dangerous. She might make decisions men disagreed with. She might refuse to remarry and stay independent permanently. The pressure to remarry was intense, especially for younger widows. Family members, church officials, community leaders, all pushing her toward another husband, another legal death. Some widows gave in. Others fought back. The ones who fought back knew exactly what they were fighting for, their legal existence as human beings. Daily life changed completely. Margaret could walk into a bank and conduct business in her own name. She could hire servants, fire them if needed. She could decide where to live, what to spend money on, whether to travel. These tiny freedoms felt enormous after decades of needing permission for everything. She could even commit crimes now, which sounds weird, but think about it. During marriage, she couldn't be held legally responsible for most actions. As a widow, full legal responsibility, good and bad. The contrast with married life was stark. Remember, these same women had spent decades unable to control their own inherited property. They'd watched their husbands sell family heirlooms, mismanage businesses they'd brought to the marriage, make terrible decisions with their money. Now suddenly, they could fix those mistakes, if there was anything left to fix. Many widows became shrewd businesswomen, making up for decades of watching men fumble their inheritances. They'd learned what not to do by watching their husbands do it. Some women, I hate to say this, but some women hoped for widowhood. Not actively, but when their husbands got sick, part of them looked forward to freedom. Wives of gambling addicts, cruel men, or just incompetent money managers, they knew widowhood was their only escape route. Divorce was nearly impossible, and still left women legally powerless in most cases. Death was the only door out. And yes, there are documented cases of women who may have helped their husbands through that door a little faster. But here's where this story takes an interesting turn. Some married women found a different kind of door, a loophole that let them taste legal personhood while their husbands were still alive. It was called the femme sole merchant exception, and it was revolutionary. Married women who could prove they were traders or businesswomen could register as legally independent for commercial purposes only. Think about that. You could be legally dead as a wife, but legally alive as a merchant. The same woman, split legal existence. Femme sole merchants. Picture medieval London, 1350s. The cobblestone streets buzz with commerce. Wall merchants hawking their wares, bakers selling fresh loaves, and there, running her own stall, a married woman. Wait, what? How is this possible? Under Coverture, married women couldn't even buy bread without their husband's permission. But here she is, negotiating prices, signing contracts, collecting debts. Her name's in the guild records. She pays taxes. She's legally independent. Kind of. Welcome to one of history's strangest legal loopholes. The femme sole merchant exception. Medieval England created this bizarre category. A married woman could register as femme sole for business purposes only. Sole meaning single, unmarried. Even though she wasn't, it's like being legally schizophrenic. Monday through Saturday, she's running her brewery, signing contracts, taking people to court over unpaid bills. She's a full legal person in the marketplace. Sunday comes, she walks home to her husband. Suddenly she's nobody again. Can't own the house, can't control her personal property, can't make decisions about her own children. Business Margaret versus wife Margaret. Two different people, same body. Why did medieval lawmakers create this exception? Simple. Money. Trade was booming. England needed skilled merchants. Turns out, lots of women were really good at business, especially widows who'd learned from their husbands. But when these capable businesswomen remarried, their trading expertise suddenly became legally worthless? That made no economic sense. So the law bent, slightly, just enough to keep commerce flowing. These women could register their trades with local authorities, become merchant sole despite being married. But here's the catch. This independence existed only within the marketplace walls. The paperwork for this is wild. Court records from 1372 show Alice de Stretford, ale brewer, officially registered as femme sole. Her husband exists somewhere in the background, but in all business documents, Alice acts alone. She buys barley, hires workers, extends credit to customers. When someone defaults on payment, Alice sues them. Not Alice and her husband, just Alice. She wins. The court enforces her claim, For all business purposes, she's legally single, but if Alice wants to sell her actual house, nope, that requires her husband's signature. Split existence. Most femme sole merchants were in specific trades. Brewing, obviously. Women dominated that industry. Silkworking, embroidery, food preparation. These weren't random choices. These were businesses women had always done, even under coverture. Wives had breweries in their homes. They sold excess food at markets. The femme sole system just made it officially legal. But notice what's missing. Land dealing, money lending, large-scale importing. The really big money trade stayed male only. This loophole had boundaries, convenient boundaries that protected male economic dominance while allowing female commercial participation. The psychological toll must have been intense. Imagine living this double life. At the market, you're respected. People seek your advice. You make decisions worth hundreds of pounds. Guild members consult you about trade regulations. You're somebody. Then you go home. Your husband can beat you legally, take your personal belongings, give away your children, and you have zero recourse, because at home, you're nobody. Some women describe feeling like they were two different people. Market Alice who mattered, home Alice who didn't exist. The whiplash between power and powerlessness, daily. Court records reveal the tensions this created. 1389, London. Margaret Kemp, femme sole merchant, sues John Walker for unpaid wool debts. She wins 40 shillings, significant money. But later that year, her husband Thomas gets into legal trouble. His creditors try to seize Margaret's business assets to pay his debts. Now Margaret's in court again, this time arguing her business property is separate from her husband's. Gets complicated fast. The judge has to decide, is she femme sole Margaret or wife Margaret? Which legal identity applies? The court struggled with these split personality cases constantly. Some women gamed the system brilliantly. They'd register as femme sole merchants, then funnel family assets through their businesses. Technically legal since business property stayed separate. Smart wives would lend money to their own companies, creating paper trails that protected family wealth from their husband's creditors. Others used their businesses to hide assets before divorce. Medieval style. The law created a loophole. These women drove entire trucks through it. Lawyers hated this. Husbands sometimes hated it too, but the courts usually upheld it. Business was business. The irony gets deeper when you realize what happens next in our story. While medieval English women fought for scraps of legal recognition through femme sole status, there's this other civilization, one that existed thousands of years earlier, where women didn't need loopholes or exceptions or split legal personalities, where married women were just full legal people, all the time, in every context. Ancient Egypt. We're about to journey there, and what you'll discover will make medieval England's progressive femme sole system look absolutely primitive by comparison. Think about the absurdity for a second. Medieval England is patting itself on the back for letting married women own businesses, sometimes with restrictions, if they register properly, only during business hours. Meanwhile, 3,000 years earlier, Egyptian women owned property, initiated divorces, wrote wills, and conducted business as naturally as breathing. No paperwork, no exceptions, no split personalities, just normal legal equality. It's like discovering that ancient Rome had smartphones while we're celebrating the invention of the telegraph. History doesn't always move forward. Sometimes it moves backwards, dramatically. The femme sole merchants represent something important though. Proof that even the most restrictive legal systems have cracks. Women found them, exploited them, and survived through them. These businesswomen kept commerce flowing during one of history's most oppressive periods for married women. They showed that female economic participation wasn't just beneficial, it was essential. Their success helped plant the seeds for larger changes coming centuries later. But first, Let's travel back in time to see what real gender equality looked like. Ancient Egypt awaits, and you won't believe what we find there. Ancient Egypt's radical difference. Picture this, 2575 BCE. While we've been talking about women disappearing legally the moment they married, there was this civilization doing something completely different. Ancient Egypt. Here's what blows my mind about this. Egyptian women were full legal persons. Before marriage, during marriage, after marriage, they owned property in their own names, made contracts, could initiate divorce and walk away with their stuff. This wasn't some brief experiment. This system lasted thousands of years. We're talking about a legal system that was already ancient when Rome was just getting started. And get this, they wrote everything down. Papyrus documents that survived 4,500 years, showing Egyptian women conducting business, suing people in court, writing wills. Real evidence of freedoms that English women wouldn't see until the 1880s. Think about that timeline for a second. These ancient documents are proof that coverture wasn't inevitable. It was a choice. Here's one of my favourite examples. A papyrus from around 1150 BCE shows a woman named Naunakafti writing her will. She's dividing up her property between her children, deciding who gets what based on how they treated her in old age. The kids who took care of her, they inherit. The ones who didn't, cut out completely. And this is a married woman doing this. Her husband has zero say in how she disposes of her stuff. Egyptian marriage contracts are wild when you compare them to what we've been discussing. These documents spell out exactly what happens if the marriage ends. The wife keeps her property, gets a share of what they accumulated together. Sometimes she keeps the house. The husband has to pay support. One contract from the 7th century BCE gives the wife 2/3 of everything if he divorces her. 2/3. This isn't charity, it's legal protection built right into the system. And divorce? Egyptian women could initiate it themselves. No begging courts, no proving fault. They could just say this isn't working and leave with their property. The papyrus records show women divorcing husbands for various reasons: infidelity, abuse, or sometimes just incompatibility. Compare that to medieval Europe, where a woman couldn't even own the clothes on her back, let alone leave her marriage. The contrast is staggering when you really think about it. Business records from ancient Egypt show women as merchants, landowners, moneylenders. There's this one document showing a woman named Isis, not the goddess, just a regular woman with that name, lending money to a man and charging interest. She's the creditor, he's the debtor. She owns the transaction completely. Meanwhile, 15 centuries later in England, married women couldn't even open a bank account. The legal time travel here is mind-bending. What's really striking is how normal this seemed to be in Egypt. These aren't stories about exceptional women fighting the system. These are routine legal documents showing women participating in economic life as equals. Property deeds with women's names on them. Court cases where women represent themselves. Wills where mothers leave property to daughters who they know will keep controlling it after marriage. It was just how things worked. Now here's what gets me about this comparison. When Victorian English people encountered these ancient Egyptian documents in the 1800s, they were shocked. Here were their ancestors, well, not literally their ancestors, but people from the deep past, giving women rights that Victorian women were still fighting for. Some scholars tried to dismiss it as primitive or pagan, but the evidence was right there in black and white, or rather black ink on papyrus. Think about this timeline. Egyptian women had property rights in 2575 BCE. Roman women lost many of those rights under Manius marriage. Medieval European women lost even more under coverture. Victorian women were clawing their way back to legal personhood, and they were actually trying to recover rights that had existed in Egypt 4,000 years earlier. It's like legal time moved backwards, then slowly crawled forward again. Wild to think about. The Egyptian system shows us something crucial about coverture. It wasn't natural, it wasn't inevitable, it wasn't the only way to organise marriage and property. Other cultures figured out how to let women remain legal persons after marriage. The technology existed: papyrus, contracts, courts, witnesses. The legal infrastructure was there. What was missing in places like medieval England wasn't capability, it was will. The choice to treat married women as people. So when we talk about the long struggle for married women's property rights in England and America, remember this: they weren't inventing something new. They were recovering something lost, something that had worked just fine in ancient Egypt for thousands of years. These weren't radical new ideas. They were ancient rights, finally coming home. And that gives me hope that what seems impossible now might just be waiting for the right moment to return. Islamic Mah traditions. While European women watched their property vanish at the altar, something completely different was happening across the Islamic world: the Mah system. And this is where our story takes a fascinating turn, because Islamic law created something that sounds almost impossible, given what we've learned so far: a marriage system where women actually kept control of wealth. Not just some of it, all of it. The Mah wasn't just a symbolic gesture or family negotiation, it was legally hers, forever. Here's what makes this so different from everything we've covered. In English law, remember, everything the bride owned became her husband's property the moment they married. But Mah, that's a completely separate category. It's not a dowry in the European sense. It's not her father's property being transferred. It's wealth that becomes hers alone, specified in the marriage contract, and her husband can never touch it. He can't sell it, can't spend it, can't use it to pay his debts. The origins go back to pre-Islamic Arabia, but the Quran codified these protections in the 7th century. Think about the timing here. While medieval Europe was developing increasingly restrictive laws about married women, Islamic jurisprudence was establishing that mahar belonged exclusively to the wife. The marriage contract would specify the exact amount: gold, silver, property, sometimes entire estates. And this wasn't just theory. Islamic courts consistently ruled that husbands who tried to claim their wives' mahar had zero legal standing. What's brilliant about this system is how it protected women's interests in ways coverture never did. If the marriage ended, through divorce or widowhood, the woman kept her mahar completely. No questions, no legal battles, no depending on her husband's generosity. It was hers by right. And if her husband died in debt, his creditors couldn't touch her mahar to settle his obligations. Imagine explaining that to a 19th century English woman who just lost her inheritance to her husband's gambling debts. The amounts could be substantial. We're talking about mahar agreements for thousands of gold dinars, entire commercial properties, agricultural lands. In medieval Baghdad, some marriage contracts listed mahar worth more than most families would see in a lifetime. But here's what's interesting. It wasn't always paid up front. Often it was split into immediate mahar, given at the wedding, and deferred mahar, payable if the marriage ended. Smart financial planning, really. Security for her, manageable for him. Compare this to what we learned about coverture. English wives had no separate property. Their husbands owned everything, could spend everything, could lose everything. But Islamic wives? They had this untouchable financial foundation. They could use their mahar to start businesses, lend money, invest in trade. Some of the wealthiest merchants in medieval Cairo and Damascus were women operating with mahar capital. They were economic players in their own right, not financial dependents. The legal enforcement was real too. Islamic courts kept detailed records of mahar disputes, and they consistently sided with wives. There are case studies from medieval Egypt where husbands tried to argue that they'd given gifts instead of mahar, trying to get around the permanent ownership issue. The courts weren't having it. Marriage contract says mahar, it's mahar. End of discussion. Her property, her control. The husband's financial situation was irrelevant to her claim. I found this one story from 13th century Damascus that really drives the point home. A merchant's wife used her marker to buy a silk workshop. Her husband's business failed, creditors came after everything, but they couldn't touch her workshop. She kept operating, kept earning, actually supported the family while he rebuilt his trade. Try to imagine that scenario under English coverture. Impossible. She would have owned nothing, earned nothing, controlled nothing. Now, Ma practices varied across different regions and centuries. In some places, families negotiated modest amounts. In others, especially among wealthy merchant families, Ma could include entire trading companies. Moroccan contracts sometimes included agricultural estates. Persian agreements might specify poetry collections and libraries, alongside gold and property. But the core principle remained consistent everywhere. Whatever was designated as Ma became her exclusive property forever. This system influenced Islamic legal thinking about women's economic rights more broadly. If wives could own substantial independent wealth, then clearly they were capable legal persons who could make financial decisions. Islamic law developed detailed provisions for women's business activities, inheritance rights, and contract negotiations. The Ma system created a foundation for recognizing married women's legal capacity that wouldn't appear in English law for another 1,000 years. So while European women faced legal erasure through marriage, Islamic women maintained this protected sphere of financial independence. Not perfect, not equal to men's rights in all areas, but fundamentally different from coverture's total property confiscation. Which brings us to our next stop, ancient China, where marriage contracts got incredibly specific about property rights, duties, and protections. Written agreements that would make modern prenups look simple. China's marriage contracts. Picture this. While European women were disappearing into legal invisibility, halfway around the world, Chinese brides were signing detailed contracts that guaranteed their rights. We're talking Imperial China, dynasties stretching back thousands of years, and they figured out something that took the West until the 1800s to understand. Marriage didn't have to erase women. These weren't just ceremonies or traditions. These were legal documents, written protection, and honestly, some of these contracts were more progressive than anything we've seen so far. We're going back to the Tang dynasty, around 700 CE, maybe earlier. Chinese families weren't just throwing their daughters into marriage and hoping for the best. They were negotiating, drawing up contracts that spelled out exactly what the bride would receive, what she'd keep, and what happened if things went wrong. Think prenups, but way more comprehensive. These documents covered everything from property rights to personal safety, and here's the key part. They were legally enforceable. Courts would actually uphold them. So what did these contracts actually say? First, the bride's dowry stayed hers. Not sort of hers, not technically hers, actually hers. If her husband tried to sell her jewelry or spend her money, she could take him to court. The contracts also specified living conditions, how she'd be treated by her mother-in-law, what kind of food and clothing she'd receive, even how many servants she'd have. Some contracts included clauses about domestic violence. Physical abuse could void the entire marriage agreement. But it gets better. Many Chinese marriage contracts included divorce provisions. The wife could initiate divorce under certain circumstances: abandonment, abuse, failure to provide support. And when she left, she took her property with her. Compare that to medieval Europe, where a woman couldn't even own the clothes on her back after marriage. Chinese wives often kept separate finances, ran their own businesses, and made independent legal decisions. The husband couldn't just absorb everything she owned. The law wouldn't let him. Think about where we've been in this story. Rome, where wives became property. Medieval Europe, where Blackstone said married women ceased to exist legally. England and America, where everything a woman owned became her husband's the moment she said "I do." Now here's China, Same time periods, completely different approach. Chinese law recognized that marriage was a partnership between two legal persons, not the absorption of one person into another. It's almost like they understood something the West forgot for 1,000 years. Let me give you a specific example. A Tang dynasty contract from around 850 CE specified that the bride would receive 2 bolts of silk, 50 ounces of silver, and a house in her name. If her husband died, she inherited half his estate plus everything she brought to the marriage. If he divorced her without cause, he had to pay penalty fees and return all her property plus interest. If she divorced him for legitimate reasons, same deal. These weren't suggestions, these were binding legal agreements with real financial consequences. And these contracts worked because Chinese society backed them up. Families took them seriously. Courts enforced them. Local magistrates heard cases where wives sued husbands for contract violations, and wives often won. There are records of Chinese women successfully reclaiming property, forcing husbands to provide promised support, even getting marriages annulled when contracts were breached. The system wasn't perfect, but it gave married women legal standing that European women wouldn't see for centuries. It gave them leverage. What's fascinating is how this worked across social classes. Wealthy families negotiated elaborate contracts with multiple properties and substantial financial provisions. But even peasant families would draw up basic agreements: who gets the goat if things go wrong, who pays for medicine if someone gets sick, what happens to the rice stores. The principle was the same at every level. Marriage was a contract between equals, not the legal disappearance of the wife. Protection scaled with resources, but the protection existed. Now, we can't romanticize this. Chinese women still faced restrictions and inequalities: foot binding, concubinage, limited career options, plenty of problems. But the marriage system itself, it preserved women's legal personhood in ways that Coverture completely destroyed. Chinese wives could own property, make contracts, represent themselves in court, control their own finances. They remained legal individuals. The marriage didn't erase them. That's a fundamentally different approach to how marriage works, and it shows what was possible. So why does this matter to our story? Because it proves something crucial. The legal erasure of married women wasn't inevitable. It wasn't natural. It wasn't the only way societies could organize marriage. Ancient Egypt protected women's rights. Islamic Mahar gave wives financial security. Chinese contracts preserved wives' legal status. Different cultures, different solutions, but the same basic understanding: marriage could protect women instead of erasing them. The West chose coverture. Other societies chose differently. But here's the harsh reality. Despite all these alternatives, despite proof that marriage could preserve women's rights instead of destroying them, coverture spread and prevailed. English common law conquered legal systems worldwide. Colonial expansion exported coverture across continents. The progressive marriage traditions of China, Egypt, and Islamic societies were overwhelmed or abandoned. The trap-like system of coverture became the global standard, and that trap was about to get even tighter, as we'll see in our next chapter. The price of a wedding. Picture this nightmare. You're 25, unmarried, and society calls you a burden. Your father's getting impatient. But if you marry, everything you own becomes his. Your inheritance, your earnings, even your clothes. Wealthy women faced this impossible choice: remain spinsters and face social death, or marry and face legal death. Poor women had it worse. They couldn't even accumulate savings to protect. Marriage was the only path to respectability, but it guaranteed economic imprisonment. This was the coverture trap. Take Margaret Cavendish in the 1600s. Born to wealth, brilliant, a writer. She wrote about the matrimonial lottery, where women gambled their entire existence on one man's character. She was lucky her husband supported her work, but she watched friends disappear into marriages where husbands squandered their wives' fortunes on gambling and mistresses. Margaret called marriage a legal way to rob women. She wasn't wrong. The law literally handed over everything a woman owned the moment she said "I do." Working class women faced even crueler math. Factory girls in Manchester earned decent wages until they married. Then every penny belonged to their husbands. Sarah Thompson worked 14-hour days in a textile mill. Her husband would wait outside on payday, take her wages, and drink them away while she and the children went hungry. She had no legal recourse. Her labour, her exhaustion, her sacrifice, all legally his property. Thousands of women lived this reality every single day. Wealthy families tried to protect their daughters with marriage settlements and trusts. Lawyers would draft complex documents, trying to preserve some independence for the bride. But here's the twisted part. These protections required the husband's cooperation. If he challenged them in court, he usually won. The law was on his side. So even the richest women entered marriage, knowing their financial security depended entirely on their husband's goodwill. It was protection built on hope, not law. Some women chose spinsterhood deliberately. Elizabeth Blackwell, America's first female doctor, remained unmarried partly for this reason. She watched married female friends lose all control over their lives and decided the social stigma was worth keeping her autonomy. But society punished these women mercilessly. They were called old maids, surplus women, burdens on their families. Churches preached that unmarried women were incomplete, unfulfilled. The pressure was relentless and cruel. Then there were the debt traps. A husband's creditors could seize his wife's inherited property to pay his gambling debts or failed business ventures. Women whose fathers left them comfortable inheritances would watch everything disappear into their husbands' financial disasters. Mary Wollstonecraft saw this happen repeatedly. She wrote about women who went from comfortable independence to destitution overnight, not through their own choices, but through Coverture laws that made their property legally his property to lose. The marriage market became literally that, a market. Fathers would calculate dowries like business investments. Daughters were commodities with price tags attached. But here's the sick irony. Once the transaction was complete, the bride lost all value as a legal person. She'd bring property into the marriage, then immediately lose all control over it. It was like selling something and then having no say in how it gets used. Women understood they were buying into their own legal erasure. Divorce wasn't an option for most women. It required an Act of Parliament in England, costing thousands of pounds. Working women had zero access to this escape route, so they were trapped permanently. Bad husband who beats you. Tough luck. Husband drinks away your inheritance. Deal with it. Husband gives your property to his mistress. Nothing you can do. The marriage contract was literally a lifetime sentence of legal non-existence. Death was often the only release. Women developed subtle forms of resistance. They'd hide money, keep secret savings, maintain friendships their husbands disapproved of. But this was dangerous. If discovered, husbands could claim even hidden assets. Some women would leave property to other women in informal arrangements, creating networks of female economic support that operated completely outside the law. They were building shadow economies to survive legal erasure. It was ingenious and heartbreaking at the same time. The psychological toll was crushing. Women wrote in diaries about feeling like they'd committed suicide by marriage, still breathing but legally dead. Frances Power Cobbe described it as civil death. Imagine knowing that saying yes to a marriage proposal meant saying no to your legal existence. The desperation in women's letters from this era is palpable. They knew exactly what they were losing, but society gave them no real choice. And just when you think it couldn't get worse, death didn't even bring freedom. Because under coverture, married women couldn't write valid wills. Everything would pass according to their husband's wishes, not theirs. Even in death, they had no voice. But that's where our story goes next, into the shocking reality that coverture didn't end at the grave. Control over women extended even beyond death itself. That control was absolute, permanent, and completely legal, when she couldn't even write a will. Here's something that'll mess with your head. You know how people talk about controlling spouses? Well, Coverture took that control straight into the grave. A married woman couldn't write a will at all. Think about that. You're dying, you want to leave something to your sister, your children, maybe a charity you care about, but legally, you own nothing. You are nothing. So there's nothing to will away. The law said your husband owns everything, including your final wishes. But here's where it gets really twisted. The moment that same woman became a widow, suddenly she could write all the wills she wanted. Her husband dies, and boom, she's a legal person again. She can own property, make decisions, control her assets. It's like someone flipped a switch. Married, legal ghost. Widowed, full human being with rights. The system was so brutal that death literally set women free, and they knew it. Many widows described feeling liberated despite their grief. This created some seriously morbid situations. Picture wealthy widows carefully crafting detailed wills, then getting remarried and watching those wills become completely void the instant they said "I do" again. All those careful plans for their children, their property, their legacy, gone. Back to legal nothingness. Some women would write wills, remarry, become widowed again, then have to rewrite everything, like some cruel legal Groundhog Day. Their final wishes held hostage by their marital status. And get this, even if a woman was on her deathbed, married, wanting to leave a small keepsake to her mother or sister, she legally couldn't. Her husband controlled everything, even her jewelry, her personal letters, her grandmother's ring. He could promise her on her deathbed that he'd honor her wishes, then turn around after her funeral and sell everything or give it to his new wife. She'd have no legal recourse because dead women can't sue. Neither could living wives, for that matter. The courts saw this as perfectly normal. Judges would literally tell dying women, "Sorry, you can't make a will, you're married." There are records of women pleading from their deathbeds, begging to leave something, anything, to their children from previous marriages. Denied. The stepfather legally owned everything, including items that came from the children's deceased father. Imagine being a child, watching your stepfather sell your mother's things, your father's things, and knowing she died powerless to stop it. Some husbands were decent about this. They'd honor their dying wife's wishes, distribute things fairly, take care of her family. But here's the thing, they didn't have to. That was pure charity, not legal obligation. And plenty of men weren't charitable, especially if they remarried quickly, which was common. The new wife would want the old wife's things gone, and legally, there was nothing anyone could do about it. The first wife might as well have never existed. This whole thing affected rich and poor women differently, but it screwed them both. Wealthy women lost control of valuable estates, land, investments that had been in their families for generations. Poor women lost small but precious things, their mother's wedding ring, a family Bible, maybe some saved coins. But the emotional impact was the same. Your final wishes didn't matter. Your relationships didn't matter. Your love for your children didn't matter. Only your husband's ownership mattered. You know what's really haunting? Reading old letters from women who knew they were dying and felt completely helpless about what would happen after. They'd write to sisters, to adult children, begging them to understand why they couldn't protect the family heirlooms, why they couldn't ensure their children would get anything. These women were grieving their own powerlessness while also grieving their approaching death, dying twice, once legally, once physically, and they'd been legally dead for years already. Some families tried to work around this nightmare. Before a woman got married, her father might set up complex trusts to protect her inheritance. But these were expensive, required good lawyers, and didn't always work. Courts sometimes ruled that these trusts violated the natural law of marriage. Natural law, meaning a wife's legal death was considered natural. The system actively fought against any attempt to let women control their own stuff, even from beyond the grave. Here's something that really gets me. This wasn't ancient history. American women couldn't reliably write meaningful wills until the 1870s and 1880s, when the Married Women's Property Acts finally passed. That means your great-great-grandmother might have lived through this, might have died unable to leave you anything directly, even if she wanted to. Everything had to go through her husband first. Her love, her intentions, her final gifts to her family, all filtered through a man's decisions. The really chilling part, this was considered moral, righteous, godly. Churches preached that this system honoured God's plan for marriage. Legal scholars wrote eloquently about how beautiful it was that husband and wife became one person. They just forgot to mention that one person was always the husband. Even death couldn't free a married woman from this erasure. But some women refused to accept this fate. They fought back, and that's where our story turns next, to the brave souls who said enough. The women who fought back. Here's what gets me about this part of the story. After centuries of legal erasure, some women started saying no. Not quietly, not politely. They wrote letters. They refused marriage. They hid assets. They fought in courts they technically couldn't even access. These weren't just rich ladies with nothing better to do. These were mothers, merchants, writers, who looked at Coverture and said, "This is insane." We're talking about women who risked everything to punch holes in a 1,000-year-old system. March 31st, 1776. Abigail Adams sits down to write what might be the most famous letter in American women's history. Her husband John's in Philadelphia, helping write the Declaration of Independence. She knows they're creating a new country with new laws, so she writes him 8 words that still give me chills. Remember the ladies and be more generous and favourable to them than your ancestors. Don't give such unlimited power to husbands. She's literally watching them invent America and begging them not to repeat England's mistakes. John Adams' response. He laughed, called her letter saucy, said men know better than to repeal their masculine systems. Then he wrote back with this gem, "We know better than to repeal our masculine systems. Depend upon it, we know better than to repeal our masculine systems." The man who helped write "All men are created equal" couldn't see the irony. Abigail's fighting for basic legal existence, and he's making jokes. This dismissal would fuel women's rights activism for the next century. She'd planted a seed he couldn't kill. But Abigail wasn't alone. Mercy Otis Warren wrote political plays attacking British tyranny and somehow managed to keep her property when she married. Judith Sargent Murray published essays arguing women deserved equal education. These weren't quiet rebels. They used their pens like weapons. Murray wrote in 1790 that women's supposed intellectual inferiority was just lack of opportunity. Warren turned her parlour into a political salon where men and women debated as equals. Small acts, huge implications. They were rewriting what women could be. Then there were the secret rebels, women who never made it into history books but fought coverture in their daily lives. They hid money from abusive husbands. They secretly sold property before marriage and stashed the proceeds with trusted relatives. Some ran businesses under male relatives' names while keeping the profits. Others formed informal networks, lending money to women trapped in bad marriages. These weren't legal victories, they were survival tactics. Quiet revolutions happening in bedrooms, kitchens, and shop floors across America. Some women made the ultimate sacrifice. They chose spinsterhood. In a world where unmarried women faced social stigma, economic hardship, and family pressure, some looked at Coverture and said no thanks. They'd rather be poor and free than rich and legally dead. Catherine Beecher, never married, founded schools for women instead. She watched her sisters lose their property to husbands and decided education was better than erasure. These women traded social acceptance for legal existence. Not everyone could make that choice, but some did. Wealthy families started getting creative. Marriage settlements became more common, complicated legal documents that protected some of a woman's property from her husband's control. But here's the thing, these required expensive lawyers, sympathetic male relatives, and husbands who'd agree to limit their own power. Most women couldn't access this protection. It was like having a lifeboat on a sinking ship, but only first-class passengers got seats. Still, every protected estate was proof that coverture could be challenged. Small cracks in a massive wall. Ideas were crossing oceans. Mary Wollstonecraft's Vindication of the Rights of Woman reached America in 1792, calling marriage legalized prostitution under coverture. American women read her arguments and started connecting dots. If they could revolt against British political tyranny, why not legal tyranny at home? The same Enlightenment ideas fueling revolution, life, liberty, property, applied to women too. Revolutionary rhetoric was dangerous when women started using it. Suddenly coverture looked less like natural law, more like oppression with fancy legal language. These early rebels inspired something incredible. Other women started noticing their own legal invisibility. Mothers who couldn't write wills, working women whose husbands stole their wages, widows who lost everything when they remarried. What had seemed normal started looking insane. Women began talking to each other about their experiences, sharing stories, realizing they weren't alone. The isolation coverture created that was breaking down. And when women started connecting, comparing notes, organizing, that's when real change became possible. The ground was shifting, the convulsions were starting. Not just individual women fighting back, but organized resistance. Women's benevolent societies that functioned as informal legal networks. Literary clubs where women discussed political rights alongside poetry. Religious revival movements where women found their voices and refused to give them up at marriage. Each small victory created ripples. Every woman who kept her property, spoke publicly, or refused an unwanted marriage, proved change was possible. The system that had seemed eternal was showing cracks everywhere. By the 1830s, something remarkable was happening. American states were starting to listen, not because politicians suddenly developed feminist consciousness, but because economic reality was forcing change. Panic of 1837 left families desperate to protect assets from creditors. If women could own property separately from their husbands, family wealth might survive economic disaster. Self-interest was about to accomplish what decades of moral arguments couldn't. Mississippi was preparing to shock the world. The first crack in coverture's armor was coming from the most unexpected place. How America changed first. Mississippi, 1839. Not exactly where you'd expect the first crack in coverture's armor. But here's the thing about legal change. It often starts in the most unlikely places. While England's still decades away from reform, while Victorian women are fighting tooth and nail for basic rights, Mississippi quietly passes something called the Married Women's Property Act. And yeah, it's not perfect. It's not even close to perfect. But it's the first time in 1,000 years that married women get to own property again. Picture Mississippi in 1839. Cotton plantations, economic uncertainty, and men getting nervous about their debts. The panic of 1837 just hit. Businesses are failing, fortunes disappearing overnight. And here's where it gets interesting. Wealthy families start realizing that coverture might actually hurt them. If a husband goes bankrupt, his creditors can seize everything, including his wife's inherited property. Her father's plantation, her grandmother's jewelry, gone, even though it was never really his to begin with. So Mississippi lawmakers craft something revolutionary, though they'd never call it that. The Married Women's Property Act of 1839. It lets wives own property separately from their husbands. Land, enslaved people, inheritances, hers to control. Well, sort of. Here's the catch that shows how far we still have to go. She can own it, but she can't really manage it without her husband's consent. It's legal protection, not legal equality. But after 1,000 years of nothing, it's a start. The resistance is immediate and fierce. Traditional lawyers argue this destroys the sacred unity of marriage. Judges worry about chaos in the courts. Religious leaders preach about disrupting God's natural order. But you know what's stronger than tradition? Money. When wealthy planters realized their wives' property could shield family assets from creditors, suddenly separate property doesn't seem so threatening to the natural order anymore. Economics always trumps ideology when enough rich people are worried about their fortunes. Other states start paying attention, not because they suddenly care about women's rights. Let's be honest here. They care about protecting family wealth during economic downturns. Arkansas follows in 1846, then Texas in 1848. Each state tweaks the language, adds restrictions, limits the scope. These aren't feminist manifestos, they're economic protection measures that accidentally give women legal personhood back. Sometimes progress comes sideways when you're not expecting it. Sometimes the right thing happens for completely wrong reasons. But here's what's wild about these early acts. They create this bizarre legal split personality for married women. She can own a plantation with 50 enslaved people, but she can't sign a contract to sell cotton without her husband's signature. She can inherit thousands of dollars, but she can't open a bank account. She can legally possess property worth more than most men will ever see, but she still can't vote, serve on a jury, or represent herself in court. Progress, but make it complicated. The real test comes in the courtrooms. Wives start suing to protect their separate property. Husbands challenge the laws, claiming they violate their marital rights. Creditors argue the whole system is designed to defraud them. And slowly, case by case, judges start ruling that yes, women can be legal persons and married at the same time. Shocking concept, right? These early court decisions become the foundation for everything that follows. Legal precedent, one lawsuit at a time. New York's watching all this unfold. The state where women's rights activism is really taking off. They see what Mississippi started and think, we can do better. By 1848, New York passes a more comprehensive Married Women's Property Act. This one actually lets wives control their property, not just own it, make contracts, conduct business, keep their earnings. It's still not full equality, but it's getting closer to treating married women like actual human beings with legal rights. The ripple effect is undeniable. Massachusetts in 1855, Pennsylvania in 1848. State after state starts chipping away at Coverture's foundation. Each law a little different, each one testing the boundaries of what society will accept. Some focus on inherited property, others on earnings. Some require court approval for major decisions, others grant more autonomy. It's messy, inconsistent, and gradual. But that's how real change happens, not all at once, but piece by piece, state by state. By the 1850s, America's ahead of the game. While English women are still completely erased by marriage, American women in many states can at least own property. It's not everything, but it's something, and something becomes a foundation you can build on. These early property acts prove that coverture isn't natural law or divine will, it's just human law, made by humans and therefore changeable by humans. That realization becomes incredibly powerful ammunition for what comes next. But across the Atlantic, Victorian England is still locked in the old system. Wives completely absorbed into their husband's legal identity. No property rights whatsoever. English reformers are watching America's experiment with fascination and envy. They're organizing, writing, petitioning, preparing for their own battle against a legal system that's had centuries to entrench itself. The fight in England is going to be longer, harder, and more dramatic. And that's where our story heads next. To drawing rooms and Parliament halls, where the real war begins. The long battle for Property Acts. Back to England, 1860s. Victorian women are done being legal ghosts. They've watched Mississippi, New York, and other American states pass Property Acts, while English wives still can't own a penny of their own earnings. The frustration is building. Middle-class women who run businesses, write novels, inherit family estates, all of it legally belongs to their husbands the moment they marry. Some of these women have had enough of being nobody. The campaign starts with a pamphlet. Sounds boring, right? But this 1856 piece by Barbara Lee Smith hits like dynamite. She lays out the brutal mathematics of coverture, how a working woman earning good wages becomes penniless the second she marries, how wives of drunkards watch their inheritances disappear into gin shops. The pamphlet spreads through drawing rooms and women's clubs. Finally, someone said it out loud. Then comes the petition. 26,000 signatures, demanding married women's property rights. 26,000 Victorian women, brave enough to sign their names to something revolutionary. They present it to Parliament in 1856. The response? Polite dismissal. Politicians literally laugh about hysterical women wanting to upset the natural order. But the women aren't giving up. If anything, the mockery makes them angrier. The Kensington Society becomes their headquarters. These aren't radical firebrands, they're respectable middle-class women using tea parties to plan legal revolution. Emily Davies, Frances Buss, Elizabeth Garrett Anderson. They meet in parlours, but they're strategizing like generals. How do you change a 1,000-year-old legal system when you can't even vote? You find male allies. You build public pressure. You never stop. John Stuart Mill becomes their champion in Parliament. His wife Harriet Taylor Mill had been fighting this battle for decades before her death. Mill introduces bill after bill, year after year. Each time, it dies in committee or gets watered down beyond recognition. The debates get nasty. MPs literally argue that giving women property rights will destroy the family, corrupt feminine nature, turn wives against husbands. But something's shifting in public opinion. Newspapers start running stories about wives trapped by coverture. The case of Susanna Palmer, whose husband sold her successful millinery business and spent the money on his mistress, while Susanna couldn't legally object. Stories like this multiply. Middle-class Victorian families realize their daughters face the same legal erasure as everyone else. The pressure builds. August 9th, 1870. The Married Women's Property Act finally passes. The celebration in feminist circles is electric. After 14 years of petitions, lobbying and defeats, they've done it. Married women can now keep their wages, their investments, their inheritances up to £200. It feels revolutionary. Frances Buss writes to friends about this victory, changing everything. The impossible happened, except, wait, as women start trying to use these new rights, the limitations become crushing. £200? That's maybe a year's wages for a governess. Anything beyond that still belongs to her husband. She can keep small inheritances, but not family estates. Her business profits above £200. His. The Act protected pin money, not real financial independence. The lawyers make it worse. Courts interpret every clause as narrowly as possible. Women discover they can keep some wages, but still can't spend them without husband's permission in many cases. They can inherit small amounts but can't control how those amounts are invested. It's legal independence with training wheels that never come off. The 1870 Act was a start, not a solution. So the fight continues. These women didn't spend 14 years winning a partial victory just to declare mission accomplished. They regroup, reorganize, and push for comprehensive reform. The arguments are stronger now. They can point to the 1870 Act and say, see, the world didn't end when wives kept their wages. They're building towards something bigger, something that will actually work. By 1880, the campaign for a real Property Act is unstoppable. The limited 1870 reforms proved married women could handle their own money without chaos erupting. Victorian society adapted. The sky didn't fall. Now it's time to finish what they started, to give married women full property rights, not just the scraps. They're 12 years away from complete legal personhood. Almost there. Echoes in modern law. Here's what's going to mess with your head. We've been talking about coverture like it's ancient history, medieval stuff, Victorian nonsense. But here's the thing, some of these restrictions existed into the 1980s. Yeah, the 1980s. While people were listening to Madonna and using personal computers, married women in America were still fighting for basic legal rights that single women had always enjoyed. Some of your parents lived through this. Picture this. It's 1960. A married woman gets called for jury duty in most states, and she's automatically excused, not because she's busy, because she's married. The law assumed married women couldn't be impartial jurors because their husbands might influence their decisions. Single women? Fine. Widows? No problem. Married women? Legally incompetent to judge their fellow citizens. This lasted until the mid-1960s in most places. Some states held out even longer. Banking was worse. Until the Equal Credit Opportunity Act of 1974, banks could refuse credit cards to married women, even working wives with their own incomes. Banks would say the husband's signature was required because married women weren't financially reliable. They might get divorced, get pregnant, quit working. A single woman could get credit easier than a married one. Think about that. Marriage made you less trustworthy to banks, not more stable. Employment discrimination was legal too. Airlines routinely fired flight attendants for getting married until the late 1960s. The logic? Married women would get distracted by domestic duties. Some teaching contracts included morality clauses that let schools fire married women who got pregnant. As late as 1978, companies could fire pregnant women without any legal consequence. The Pregnancy Discrimination Act finally changed that. 1978, not 1878. That's 45 years ago. But the most shocking echo, marital exclusions in law. Until the 1980s, most states had legal exceptions that said certain crimes couldn't happen between spouses. The law literally said married people couldn't commit certain offences against each other because they were legally one person. These exclusions covered everything from theft, your husband couldn't steal your property because it was already his, to much more serious crimes that I won't detail here. Social security benefits reflected coverture thinking too. When the system launched in 1935, married women couldn't collect benefits based on their own work records if they were higher than spousal benefits. The assumption was that husbands were primary breadwinners and wives were dependents. This created situations where women who worked their entire lives got the same benefits as women who never worked at all. Some of these inequities weren't fully addressed until the 1980s. Even death benefits carried echoes. Until 1975, Social Security automatically paid survivor benefits to widows, but required widowers to prove they were financially dependent on their deceased wives to qualify. The law assumed men were always breadwinners and women always dependents. A working mother could die, but her husband might not get survivor benefits to help raise their children because the law couldn't imagine men as dependents. Different states moved at different speeds. Mississippi, surprisingly, had better married women's property rights than some northern states into the 1960s. Louisiana's civil law system always gave wives more property protection, but other states clung to old restrictions. Some required husbands' written permission for wives to get business licenses into the 1970s. The patchwork of progress meant your rights depended entirely on where you happened to live. What's wild is how normal this all seemed. Nobody thought it was shocking that married women needed permission to open businesses. It was just how things worked. Newspaper advice columns told wives to ask husbands before making major purchases with their own earnings. This wasn't considered oppressive, it was considered proper. Good wives didn't challenge these restrictions, they embraced them as signs of feminine virtue and marital harmony. The speed of change was remarkable once it started. Between 1960 and 1980, American women went from needing husbands' signatures for credit cards to running major corporations, from being automatically excused from jury duty to serving on the Supreme Court. Ruth Bader Ginsburg, who fought many of these legal battles as a lawyer, lived to see the world completely transformed. She was born when Coverture was still strong, and died when women were CEOs. So here we are, rights that seem basic and obvious to us today, opening a bank account, serving on a jury, keeping your own paycheck, were revolutionary concepts just 50 years ago. Your grandmother might remember when these were controversial ideas. These weren't ancient injustices, they were recent ones, and that's worth remembering. Rights can disappear as quickly as they appeared if we're not paying attention. Sleep well, and remember how far we've come.